So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Sheila Fitzpatrick, president and founder of FitzPatrick Associates. It says here that she has over 38 years experience in global data privacy, data protection, and sovereignty compliance. I don't really believe it's all those many years, Sheila, but that's a whole different conversation, okay? Sheila's considered to be a world expert in data privacy laws, having worked with the US government, the European Union, data protection authorities across Europe, Asia Pac, and Americas, particularly around global data compliance, data sovereignty, cybersecurity regulations, and obligations. Take a breath in, okay? I suspect the next half an hour is going to be truly fascinating, Sheila, so the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. For me, there's always two challenges. One is getting up the stairs without tripping, and the other one is making sure the clicker works. So thank you, everyone. Is everyone having a great time? Good conference? Everybody awake? Okay, if you fall asleep during my presentation, I do call on you, so I'll warn you now. How many of you have heard me speak before? Few of you. Good, because then you can act like you haven't heard my stories before. So one of the things that you'll find out about me is that I am extremely passionate about privacy laws. And I take it a little bit differently than a lot of other people. I look at privacy and security very differently, and that's what I want to talk about today. My expertise is in data protection regulations in over 160 countries. I have a very boring life. My entire life is privacy law. But I did start at the age of 5. That's why I've been doing it for 38 years. People have now figured out how old I am, and that's not a really good thing anymore. So I will warn you about one thing, is that one of my pet peeves that'll come out today is that when I ask you about your privacy program and you start talking to me about your security program, I'm going to slap you. Because privacy and security are not the same thing. And we're definitely, and I love someone back there is nodding. Have I slapped you before? Hopefully not. So I'm going to really focus on, first of all, I'll start by why all of a sudden are we hearing more about this. So I sit on the advisory board to the EU, and the EU Commission actually did a study in April of this past year. And they interviewed and they studied and they analyzed about 25,000 global companies, all of which claim to be compliant with GDPR or sold solutions to help you become compliant around GDPR. And they found out that less than 12% actually understood what GDPR really was and what it meant to your business and the fundamental changes. Because every single company focused on technology and tools and didn't focus on privacy. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today. And why are people so confused? Why are they so, just really still struggling with what GDPR is and what it means? Well, for a number of reasons. One is that a number of companies jumped on the GDPR bandwagon and claimed to be experts. And this is nothing against any companies here today, but many companies that had never operated in the privacy space or even knew what privacy really meant, all of a sudden were GDPR experts. Now, I don't remember any of these companies operating in the privacy world when I was there 38 years ago starting out. If I could have sped up my career, I would have and done it very quickly. But what happened was the day after GDPR was ratified in April of 2016, I went on the website of 150 of the world's biggest companies, and every single one of them, the day after it was ratified, had GDPR expert on their website. I don't know how that happened because obviously they know more than I do because it took me a long time to become an expert in this area. GDPR also became a revenue generator for a lot of tech companies, law firms, consultancies. It generated more revenue than Y2K. So the EU Commission did a study as well and found out that over 60 billion US dollars in revenue was generated as a result. And now a lot of these companies have moved on to ePrivacy Act or the ePrivacy regulation that'll be coming out in 2020 or 2021. There's little to no experience really in privacy law. Unless you've been doing it forever, you can't just become a privacy expert overnight. A lot of IP attorneys and IT attorneys are now moving to privacy, which is a good thing, but that's still causing a lot of confusion around privacy versus security. We also saw a lot of scaremongering going on. How many of you, when GDPR first went into effect for the first 3 months, were terrified because of a lot of the marketing material you were getting saying that you were going to be fined 4% of your annual global turnover? I had clients calling me absolutely paralyzed, not knowing what to do. And I said, you need to breathe, relax, focus on privacy, evolve your program. You're not going to get sanctioned unless you blatantly choose not to comply with the law. So there's a lot of mixed messages out there and no clear understanding of the difference between privacy and security. So this is the reaction that I get when I talk to people and I say, have you been overwhelmed with information around GDPR? And they literally want to close their ears, close their eyes and say, I don't want to hear about it anymore. Everyone's sick of hearing about it. So what I wanted to talk to you about today were just some basic facts and myths. Now, some of these you're going to say, oh, come on, Sheila, these are a given. But I will actually share some stories around these to show you that these aren't necessarily a given. We think they are, especially those of you that are data protection officers. You sort of will understand this. So the first one, GDPR only applies in the EU. Well, obviously, we all know that one of the biggest issues around GDPR is that it's the first true extraterritorial regulation, with the exception of South Korea, Japan, and Singapore. So GDPR is not the only one. So we know that that's a myth. It applies to any organization anywhere in the world that processes the personal data of EU residents. That's a given. We all know that. We've had it drilled into us. But I actually had a company, a very large organization headquartered in the UK, that their data protection officer said to me just a few weeks ago, well, if Brexit, I know Ian said we're not going to talk about Brexit, so we really won't talk about Brexit today, but if Brexit goes through, we don't have to worry about GDPR. I literally wanted to gag because I thought you have to worry about it more if Brexit goes through because you're now deemed an inadequate country. I have a lot of clients in the US that still think if they don't have a presence in the EU, that GDPR doesn't apply to them, even though they have websites where they're actually selling goods and services to EU residents. So again, a lot of misperception. Another fact or myth is that consent is the only lawful basis for processing. So every time I go into an organization and they talk about, well, there's no way we're going to be able to obtain consent from everyone out there, and that's just a ridiculous thing, and everybody gets spun up over consent, because that's all they hear about. It has to be explicit, freely given, express consent, affirmative consent. However, that's a myth, because consent, as we know, is not the only basis for processing personal data. If you're an employer in the EU, you're an employer in the US, for instance, and you have EU employees, there's no way you're going to rely on consent, because you can't expect an employee to give freely given consent to process their personal data if they want to come to work for you. That's a little bit of a forced consent. So there's situations where consent is not going to be the applicable basis. Certainly for sales and marketing, particularly marketing, consent is going to be the primary basis for processing. But in other cases, you might have a contractual obligation. You might have a legal obligation. It might be in the vital interest of the individual or national security, where you have to collect and process data. The sixth basis, which is the one that drives me a little bit crazy, a lot of things drive me crazy, but that drives me crazy as well, is legitimate interest. So when many organizations say, well, we can't rely on consent, we don't have a contractual basis, we don't have a legal basis, none of the others apply, we have a legitimate need to have that data, which may be true, but you really have to think about, does that legitimate interest infringe on the rights of the individual? So as a company, you might say, we have a legitimate interest to collect customer data because we want to be able to inform them when there's an upgrade or a warranty expiration or we need to renew the contract, but it's not really necessarily tied to the contractual terms. That might be a true legitimate interest. But if you say, well, we need that because we want to be able to continue to market to them about new products that have nothing to do with the products they currently have, or we're acquiring a new company that they might be interested in, we want to inform them. That might be legitimate interest that benefits the company, but that's not necessarily a legitimate interest that benefits the individual. So one of the myths around legitimate interest is that companies think as long as they have a right to have that data, then they can claim legitimate interest. And you always have to think about, is it in the best interest of the individual? So another myth is that GDPR compliance is just an IT problem. Every IT company jumped on the bandwagon, and all of a sudden we saw tools and technology coming out to solve your GDPR issue. And as we know, that's a myth. First and foremost, GDPR and data privacy compliance overall is a legal and compliance issue. It's a risk issue. It is not an IT issue. IT is a partner in the compliance journey, but IT alone is not going to solve or manage your compliance issue. And we saw many CISOs, no insult to CISOs out here at all whatsoever, but we saw many CISOs jumping on the bandwagon and becoming CPOs or DPOs. And there was an organization, a very large organization in Germany, that was fined 500,000 euro for appointing their CISO as their DPO. It's a direct conflict of interest. They are two very different roles. GDPR is a cultural and organizational issue. The whole idea around GDPR is to move away from thinking strictly about security and thinking about the fundamental right to privacy and the ethical use of data. And it is an issue that touches every organization or every function within an organization. It's not just an HR issue, it's not just a legal issue, it's not just an IT issue. It's an overall global issue across every function. Does that make sense? How many of you have heard these myths before? How many are bored? Okay, good. And you're too afraid to say it because I might slap you. The other thing we hear is, I hear all the time is, oh, compliance, it's easy. We can achieve it very, very quickly. We'll just go and buy compliance in a box. Well, those of you that know me know that another one of my pet peeves is you cannot buy compliance in a box. There is absolutely no organization out there that can sell you a total GDPR solution. They can sell you components of a GDPR solution. So they can sell you tools around data mapping, data classification, data security, encryption. And those are great products and great tools. But do not be misled to say if you buy those tools, you're automatically GDPR compliant, because that is absolutely not the case. GDPR requires an approach that is broad and deep. So you need to look at every function within your organization, and you have to start with the data. You don't start with the systems and the applications. You need to look at the data of your customers, your suppliers, your employees, your contractors. Every piece of data you have needs to be analyzed and investigated. It is a very complex, very cross-functional issue, as we all know. I think Ian or someone, it might have been Rob, mentioned this morning that once a company is compliant with GDPR, or they think they're compliant with GDPR, they tick the box and they're done. They never have to do anything again. That is absolutely a myth, because there is no such thing as 100% compliant. If any company in here today tells me they're 100% compliant, I will challenge you. Because there is no way, unless you're a new company that has no historical data, there is no way you're going to know where every single piece of that data resides, where it's backed up, where it's replicated, what desk drawer it sits in, what iPhone it's located on. So there's no way that you can say that you can identify every place where that data is. You can't destroy every piece of data that you have out there. So GDPR and every data privacy law is an evolution. It continues to evolve. Your data is going to evolve, your processes are going to evolve, your technologies are going to evolve. And your GDPR compliance program and any data protection program has to evolve with it. So if you think your goal is 100%, you probably want to be more realistic. A goal is like 90% or 95%, and that's more realistic. You have to make sure that you integrate GDPR into everything you do moving forward. All your policies, all your procedures, your processes, everything. GDPR needs to be an inherent part of it. And I know there's sessions on privacy by design and some of the other aspects today. It's never going to end. It's going to be transformational, and that's a good thing. Because how many of you want a job that's stagnant? You want a job that's challenging. You want a job that tests your abilities and your interests. And privacy laws are going to do that. At least they do for me, and I love it. So we're getting near the end on the facts and the myths. Global companies need to address all applicable data privacy laws. That happens to be a fact. So GDPR has definitely had a ripple effect around the world. We are seeing more and more data privacy laws emerge as a result of GDPR and as a result of other jurisdictions. Believe it or not, the fastest growing region in the world right now is in Asia Pacific. And there are laws in China, Japan, South Korea that are much more restrictive than GDPR. But while everyone was burying their heads, on GDPR and trying to figure out how to become compliant, they were ignoring what was going on in the rest of the world. So it's interesting when you think about, I love to tell my German friends, anybody from Germany here? Love Germany, spent a couple years there, but I love to tell my German friends they no longer have the most restrictive privacy law in the world. South Korea does. Mandatory 5-year imprisonment for a violation of privacy laws. And I tell my clients that I don't look good in orange or jumpsuits, so I am not going to jail on their behalf. So you really need to think about when you're building a privacy program, and GDPR was a good eye-opener or an awakener to say, we need to build a foundation of privacy that can cross borders in terms of, instead of just looking at one law and building your program around that one law, you want to build a program that is global. Look at the most restrictive law and build all your policies and procedures around that, because the laws are going to continue to change. And as I mentioned, there's a cultural and transformational change going on. So we're going to continually see countries that want to do business with Europe to expand their laws, and in some cases to even write more restrictive laws. They're actually looking at some of the ambiguity and some of the problems under the GDPR, and they're learning from that. So I think someone after me is actually talking about the global laws. So here's the point that I like to get to, fact or fiction, that GDPR is all about data security. Now, I've already given away the fact that my pet peeve is it is absolutely not all about security. Security is one component of data privacy compliance. It is not data privacy compliance. Control of data remains within the hands of the individual. Privacy is all about individual owning his or her data. As organizations, you're stewards of that data, but you never own that data. The individual always owns his or her information. So security is critical, but it's not everything. So those of you that have heard me speak before, I always use the analogy of a house, which I'll get to in a minute. But if you think about GDPR, there's 99 articles in the GDPR. Only 8 articles specifically talk about technology. The rest talk about the foundation of privacy, the data itself, the responsibility, your obligations, your fundamental right to privacy and freedom of that right. So when you think about building a compliance program, especially around GDPR, you have to think about building a house. You need to start with the blueprint or the roadmap. You would never build a house by starting with the roof. And if you started your GDPR journey by going out and investing hundreds of millions of dollars in new technology, you started with the roof. You didn't start with the ground floor. Because the ground floor is all about what is your privacy program built on? What data do you need in order to run your business? What is the absolute essential data you have to have versus the data you'd like to have? What are your policies and procedures around the collection and treatment of personal data? How did you obtain that data? Who did you obtain it from? What was your lawful basis for processing that data? What are your contractual agreements with third parties? If a regulator comes in and they do an investigation or an audit of you, they're not going to ask you what your data mapping tool is. They're not going to ask you what your data classification tool is. They're not even going to ask you about your security. They're going to ask you about your privacy program. So again, not to say technology is not important, extremely important, and it's one component. But you need to think about the foundation of privacy. And I always use the analogy of a wheel, a bicycle wheel. If you think about the bicycle as privacy, the bicycle is the foundation of privacy and the foundation of the privacy laws. It's the full life cycle of the personal data you collect from the time you collect it to the time you destroy it. It's all about how you collected it, who you collected it from. It's all about transparency. It's about your right to have that data and what you're doing with that data. It's not all about how you're securing that data. Security is extremely important. But if all you're looking at is security, what you're doing in effect is locking down data you're not legally allowed to have because you haven't looked at your privacy foundation. So I always use the analogy, if I go down the street and I rob the bank down the street, and I take that money home and I lock it in a vault in my house, and it's the most secure vault you could possibly have. It's in a locked room, it's in a locked safe. My house has security cameras. I have sensors all around. It's a fortress. When the police come knocking on my door, they're not going to care that I have the best security in the world protecting that money. They're going to ask me, whose money is it? Not my money, it's the bank's money. So when they haul me off to jail, they're not going to really care about my security program. And you have to think about privacy in the same way. If you haven't thought about that fundamental foundation of what data you're collecting, why you're collecting it, how you're collecting it, do you have a right to collect it, then the best security in the world is not going to help you. Does that make sense? How many of you have ever thought about it that way? Okay, good. A few people. I think I have a fan in there. It's like I keep looking at one person who keeps nodding, which is great. So one of the things that I also recommend, and again, I am not anti-technology. I think the companies out there today do a fabulous job with technology, and innovation is so critical to our future, but we can't innovate at the risk of privacy. We have to combine them. And so what happens oftentimes is when I try to negotiate contracts or I'm vetting third-party suppliers to find out about their privacy program, the first thing I'll ask is, tell me about your privacy program. And the first thing they'll answer is, well, our encryption technology involves, and I let them go on for about 10 minutes, and then I finally say, I'm sorry, could we get back to my question, which is, what does your privacy program look like? And oftentimes, it is totally different conversations we're having. They have no idea when I'm asking about privacy, but they can tell me all about security. And so whether you're a vendor or whether you're a customer, you need to understand the importance of privacy vetting, which is very different than security vetting. The security questionnaire is extremely important because you want to make sure that data is protected from unauthorized access and use. But before you even get there, you need to do your privacy vetting. What does your supplier's privacy program look like? If they claim to be GDPR compliant, I would do a little bit deep drill on what that actually means. Make sure they understand privacy. If they rely strictly on Privacy Shield, you might want to question that because that may not be the strongest foundation to build on, especially since that's in question right now. I also get certifications thrown at me all the time. We have ISO 27018, 27001. Fabulous, critically important standards, critically important certifications. But again, those are security and not privacy. So what I'm trying to get to is you need to establish that privacy foundation before you start looking at the security foundation and before you start investing in critical technology that will help you maintain your ongoing compliance program. Make sense? Okay, anybody asleep yet? We're on the last slide. Keep takeaways. Embrace all privacy laws, don't run away from them. I love when people say to me, what's the least amount of work we have to do to comply? It's like, don't ever ask me that. Change the conversation. Increase the level of engagement. Talk about the importance of privacy and that fundamental right of every individual. Talk about what you do with the data and what you can and cannot do with it. Engage your employees in the conversation. Engage your customers in the conversation. And understand that privacy laws are first and foremost legal and compliance issues. Risk second, technology third. That importance of privacy due diligence, if I think that Rob said people can retain about 10 or 20% of what you hear today, I'm hoping you at least retain more than that from me talking. But if you walk away and said, I don't know what she was talking about at all, but she kept saying privacy isn't security, that's what you need to take away. Understand you can't buy compliance off the shelf. Can't buy it in a box. You can buy components of it, but not the whole thing. And turn privacy compliance into your competitive advantage. To me, privacy is a positive and not a negative. And I know you've heard that today, but that is the first thing I will say to customers is stop thinking about the negative and start thinking about the positive, especially if you're in the marketing or sales organization. Marketing and sales, for some reason, seem to take GDPR very personally and think it is an affront to what they do. It is not meant as an affront to what you do. It is meant, again, to protect that fundamental right to privacy, but it allows you to be creative. It allows you to have quality leads as opposed to a quantity of leads. If people are willing to share their information, then they're willing to do business with you. Make sense? So, I think that's the first time I ever ended actually early, ever.
Thank you very much, Sheila.
Okay.
Great presentation. The good news is we certainly have time for a couple of questions.
Great.
So I'm hoping I've got my microphone man is back with me. Oh, it's dancing over there now. And guess what? We have a question back in the middle again.
Good,
We're just going to leave a microphone with you. That's what we're going to do. Yeah.
I'll have Ian in case I can't hear. Sometimes when I'm up here, I can't hear.
That's
So
all right.
translate.
It'll be fine.
Okay.
I'm not a lawyer, so may I humbly offer a postulate? Despite the name of the GDPR, is it not data law but human rights law in reality?
You're absolutely right. It is human rights, and that's exactly what the fundamental is. It's human rights and ethical use of data. You could be a lawyer. One of the good ones.
Sounds like he is a lawyer. We've got another question over on the right-hand side there. So you're the wrong side of the room now.
Get your exercise.
This is going to get your steps up, if nothing else.
I know. I should be getting my steps and doing it that way.
Yeah. You say I'm meant to be beach buddy ready for in a fortnight's time to go on holiday.
And by the way,
perhaps it should be me that's running around with the microphone. So yeah.
And I'm not nervous. I'm freezing up here. That's why I'm doing this. It's like there's cold air blowing.
Hi, Sheila. Thank you. It's James Walker, Jaw Consulting. Thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. Just a quick question for you on the certification side. You talk about, obviously, the ISO certifications there, which focus on the security side. There is something in the UK called PIMS by the British Standard. I'm not sure if you've come across it or not, but it doesn't seem to have gained much traction as of late.
Yeah.
And under GDPR, there's no particular certification scheme, in inverted commas, that's currently obviously endorsed. Right. But so what's your view on the PIMS British Standard, if you've come across it, and do you think it is something which could be used as a benchmark to vet either vendors or even look introspectively at actually gaining that if you're a vendor or a supply oneself?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I am familiar with it. I'm not intimately familiar, but I have run across it and I have had meetings about it. I think it's a good starting point. I don't think it's the be-all to end-all, but I think it's a good starting point because at least it's talking about privacy. It does gear still a little bit more towards the security side and doesn't really talk about the foundation of privacy, but I think it's something that could absolutely be built upon and could become a standard. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Any more questions? We've got time for one more quick question. Okay.
Hi, Sheila.
Okay. Hi.
Hi,
Hi.
Roberto Maranca, Schneider Electric. One day we'll all be compliant, and we need to stay compliant, right? So
Right.
we need probably have a good handle on our change processes, because that's where things are going wrong. And don't you think that privacy by design might make us be too polarized in analyzing our changes only from a privacy point of view? Because previously it was security by design, now it's privacy by design. Wouldn't we be better off telling our friends in the business, no, we need to do everything by design? So our change processes have to be really up to scratch.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And certainly I did not want to give the impression that security wasn't important. Security is extremely important. But I think the whole concept around privacy design is to change that mindset and that culture to make organizations realize the importance of privacy, where they've always been aware of the importance of security. So why the emphasis now on privacy is to embed that in the mindset as you start to build your plans, to start with that concept of privacy. What is going to be the impact on someone's personal data if I develop this new process, this new technology? Security will always be part of it because you're always going to have to protect that data. That's a given. But the word privacy has been left out of so many discussions that's why we're seeing more emphasis on it today. But that's not to say we're going to de-emphasize security by any means. So you're absolutely right. It should be both. There should be a combination, but it's like building that house. You start with privacy, and once you've defined that, then you build the security into it.
Unfortunately, we are timed out, Sheila.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your time. Sheila will be around at
you.
lunchtime for any more questions.
Okay.
So thank you very much.